Hello War of the Visions fans, I'm Jackie Fox, and in a rare follow-up before the unit is even out on Global, I want to talk a little bit about Oldoa, but I want to talk about some other things too. It seems that Oldoa, maybe even more powerful than I expected, has stronger across-the-board synergies than I expected, and I think she's going to be maybe one of the most impactful of the units that we discussed today. However, there's going to be a lot of units to talk about because while there seems to be at the moment, at least on JP, one solid team that's come out of this, and it's the first three units that you see here, I think that there's potential, especially with some synergies with a bunch of other units, that could kind of fill in gaps here if you only have some of these units, and potentially make a less aggravating version of this team. I mean, I think that while it may be working really well right now, 2 tanks and a damage dealer probably isn't the way forward into the future. It's never really been a good decision within the meta, and I mean, maybe it is now because of how much work these tanks are doing, but let's check out this team in action, courtesy of Umbra Rays here. While I do think that he has definitely a valid viewpoint, strong team here. I was actually thinking that he was using Lightning and not Fang when I was remembering this, which is a pretty cool combination with the other units. I mean, Fang is also pretty good, but I think Lightning here would have been really interesting because you have the extra follow-up damage on 2 characters, not just one, and you've got Aloa, who's pretty powerful herself. So just real recipe for damage. On the other hand, though, let me just put this out here right away. And not really talking shit here, because this is probably a good team for a lot of occasions. It's not really an anti-magic team by any means. I mean, oh wait, this is the versus water matchup. Okay, here's the team he's going to be going up against, and the Oldoa is not fully maxed in terms of level, and there's probably a couple of other things about this team, like the VCs here are not amazing. I'm sure there's stronger synergistic VCs. I've seen teams with better VCs with, you know, essentially this is replacing VV in the team composition that I've been running on my newest account. And honestly, it's keeping up in arena with all of my other accounts. It's coming in. This week I'm trying to push above 1,000 and trying to stay there with at least a couple of accounts, at least 2 by the end of the week. And this newer account that started around the time that Sephiroth was released is pushing through that pretty easily for the most part with this team, which is also doing really good in other forms of PvP, even though I don't have the best stuff for it either. This is a newer account. I'm really missing out on VCs. I recently got my team, my trust runes set up. I maybe don't have the most ideal spread of like vision cards, espers, or even TMRs, but I do have the units, and by themselves they are doing really well. I also want to point out that if you don't have VV, you could easily swap in someone like A2. Now, I don't think there's a lot of people running this, and it may not be the best team because it doesn't have the same VC synergies. We have 3 different weapon types here instead of 2, and while there was synergy between Katana and Black Mage, that same synergy doesn't necessarily work out as well with Greatsword. However, the barrier protection ability on A2 is going to be really helpful for both Dario and Helena, because each of them has a damage reduction barrier. For Helena, this comes through a sub-job and is physical. Through Dario, this is a magical barrier. And in addition to that, she also has offensive capabilities that allow her to heal herself and an ally, which is a thing that Dario does, and also a thing that Oldoa does. And when we look at this footage in just a second, we're going to see all of that together in action. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the history of ffbe, the original game, and kind of where they went wrong and why. And so a couple of things happened with ffbe before I left the game, and even a while before I left the game. These were mistakes that they made relatively early. One of those was an AoE cover mechanic, so you had AoE tanks that could protect your entire team as long as they didn't go down, lose hate, or something. And hate was turn-based typically, so it's not like a certain number of attacks and they would, stop blocking for you. They would block for you for a number of turns, and they could block for your whole party. This really, it was cheesy. And it's kind of a fun thing to do in a PvE environment, and I guess this type of thing was never really checked in PvP. It existed, and it was annoying, and it was a thing that I liked to do on occasion, but there wasn't really a thriving PvP scene there. It was never really fun to play PvP. It was kind of degenerate sometimes, or just kind of dumb or cheesy. It never really had its own good flavor in the way that this game does. And because of that, there was never really a lot of checking like that. You were always being checked by the newest bosses. So as another thing started to overlap with that, and that is that, unlike in this game, you were getting evasion from your gear, and you were getting a percentage. Like 100% evasion, you would dodge everything. So eventually it came to the point where equipping yourself with 100% evasion's worth of gear wasn't that hard. So any tank, even the very first ones with AoE cover mechanics, could pretty much cheese most content. And there was a point where I was using like a very basic Mon Leonis, oddly enough, who had an AoE cover ability and really wasn't anything else to talk about for the most part. But he had AoE cover, and I could equip him for full evade, so he was just a great tank. And this kind of broke the game to the point where bosses started getting either ridiculously complex, where you needed like a spreadsheet to defeat them, and perfect timing and perfect recall of how many turns the 4 buffs you were applying to each unit per turn were doing, because things just got really ridiculous really fast. But one of the ways that this kind of overlaps with wotv has avoided a lot of these mistakes for years, and I would say that auras are probably the closest thing that we've gotten to an AoE cover type mechanic, and auras have kind of gotten out of hand, which is a thing that Umbra's going to bring up, and a thing that makes this team particularly unbearable is that they can reduce most damage for each other due to auras, and those don't expire until they do, so it's really difficult. You have to kind of chip it down one at a time, and that in and of itself probably wouldn't be that bad, although I do want to say from a design perspective, if we're thinking of this as an AoE cover mechanic, and it really is, like if you think about kind of the way that Daisy's for anybody who was playing ffbe Season 3, the way that her limit burst indicates her, the way that she applies her AoE cover. That type of barrier thing feels very much like an aura. So, that's like, how do you cover 5 people at once? You build a shield around all of them. And that's kind of what auras feel like, so it's a little bit awkward to have a unit like Helena the Black Rose, who has her own defensive aura. But aside from that, I don't think it's particularly terrible that Dario and Oldoa themselves do. But there is another mistake that ffbe made a little bit slower, but also, like, they weren't thinking about how long the game might last, right? So they were pulling out all the stops kind of from some points in the beginning. Like, I remember 6-star Riku. That's nothing in today's terms for ffbe, but 6-star Riku, as her limit burst, could apply re-raise to your entire team, herself included, which was just nuts. There were people who had 100% heals and 100% AoE heals, and like at that point, where do you really go with a healer without making them even more of a support? So you start running into role compression issues, where to make units better, certain classes get molded in together. And one of the issues that was happening is that, dedicated supports kind of started to disappear in a way, because they were getting absorbed into tanks who had kind of breaking abilities and all sorts of things. Maybe not on par with the best breakers, and there was definitely a reason that you might want to run a breaker over them just to let them stay on tanking. But, that was one of the first ways they started expanding the tank role in the 6 and 7-star era that I remember. But it started, they started being able to do more and more and more. And we kind of saw some of these things happen, like, Charlotte's limit burst and ffbe characteristically. It's just such a good example of this, in that it's kind of that AoE break that also increases her defenses. while still her being a great tank. But with this team especially, with the combination of the mistake that maybe is Aura's at the current moment in the meta, and I'm not saying that this is an unfixable mistake, because, and one of the forms of perspective that I like to bring to these videos is this kind of thing, this pattern has happened so many times in this game before. It feels kind of weird when people jump on it every time it does, but, you know, a couple of mistakes together could ruin a game, and this maybe is one of those mistakes. That being said, it would be very easy to create aura nullification abilities, or maybe aura dampening fields or something like that, basically introducing a new penetration to deal with the problem that they created on the defensive side. And that would make teams like this a little less effective. But the other thing, and this is, I mean, it kind of happened in ffbe, and there were definitely like some counter teams that became really stacked and fucked. Counter life drain teams in ffbe's arena were just impossible to beat. They would heal more damage than you could possibly do to them just countering your attacks. And there's some of that is happening on this team. The counter heals on these tanks are especially strong, but also they have the ability to heal while attacking, and also heal while doing other things, and all sorts of ways to not only to heal themselves but to heal others. And there have always been kind of a number of issues with healers in this game that have made them one of the less likely kind of unit archetypes to run. You know, there have been times when tanks weren't that great to run in this game. There have been a lot more times when healers weren't necessarily that good to run in this game. And some of the issues they had, especially early on, was like casting times and getting their heals to land before the unit died. But even when they had instant cast heals, they still have to get their turn before that unit dies to keep them alive. But when you're applying an instant heal while you're attacking, then you're likely to get someone else. And the way that the unit targeting for some of these, like Dario's heal, or even A2's heal as well, the kind of follow-up single target property of it is that it's going to pick out that person who needs it, and it's going to instantly apply it. And if you're still alive, then you probably need healing, especially if you're a tank. You know, anytime a tank is alive, if it can heal while doing other things, that's pretty great. So when you have those two types of abilities, and then you have a bevy of units that have been given abilities like sequential healing, which Helena has, or healing on KO, which Helena has, or HP absorption on attack, which Oldoa has all over the place. There's just so many ways for units to heal themselves and others right now while doing so many other things as well, that, you know, your DPS plus your tank, that's your healer right there. You don't need a healer on your team anymore. Now, again, I don't think that 2 tanks and a DPS is going to be the best way to go moving into the future, and I anticipate with this series of tanks being released that there's going to be some more powerful threats coming in the future. But I think there's some reasons why this team is doing well now and won't necessarily do as well into the future, and I'm going to talk about some ways of countering this team potentially. You know, I'm at least going to spitball on that, although it isn't out yet, but I think there's some ways that you might be able to handle a team like this, although unfortunately some of it requires having some of the newer units yourself. But we'll get into that in due time. Let's first check out this video.
Describe as fuck whoever came up with this in the first place. May they burn and rot in the deepest circles of hell. This is one of those teams that the balancing probably should have picked up on a little bit more, and I don't even know, since it's a multi-elemental team, it's not like it can be focused on or balanced sort of against. It just seems like a team that if you grind out the reincarnations enough, it just gets scarier and scarier as it gets harder and harder to kill. And so I'm bringing this up as a warning now to global players, potentially to global players who want to be colossal assholes. Maybe there is a little bit more on global to act against this. but it does seem a tiny bit scary about how capable this team could effectively be. Because, you run across the field with all of these auras and bonuses in effect. Like, maybe you need to run a fair bit more of Dispel to kind of get this to happen properly. But you can see we just didn't really do that much already. And here comes the Limit Burst. But you can see very high power, immediate heal directly onto each other. Our characters are still kind of just trying to do too much of anything right now. Multiple hits with potentially high damage. With, again, very, 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 very high healing. And as we've said before, this is a team that is not even necessarily that maxed yet. But as you can see, doing a pretty good job of just flat out completely destroying us. Hitting us with tons of status effects. We're berserked, we're slept, we're dead. And so yeah, this is the team that is kind of scary right now. And I would even go so far as to say it's incredibly scary. I think that the amount of tanks that have come out recently is just so incredibly frustrating. And I feel like this shows just that kind of general frustration of situations that you can end up against. And there isn't really too much you could do. And it can potentially get even worse, as those characters were not necessarily even maxed, or not necessarily even the best of equipment. So yeah.
Okay, so first comment is to say that, and one thing that you should keep in mind watching my videos, and maybe I should bring up more in Arena showcases, is that what units are doing especially well in Arena in a particular week can be dependent on what those Arena buffs are. They're not the biggest thing, and I don't think that that's like all that's making this team good by any means, but it's definitely putting it a little bit over the top. It's also probably helping out Helena a bit, since she has a job type in common with Oldoa, so extra power for those two. But I don't think that this team is necessarily uncounterable. I'm not sure how much silence would do against it, but there is some potential for Dario's TMR and its TMR buff Tranquil Spirit to do some stuff against this. And really, I think that, for most players and most teams, for most people who are effectively and easily grinding their way through Arena right now, the team that you're using to do that is tuned for a completely different meta than this team represents. And I don't just mean in the way of like, this is a new thing. I'm just saying that, like, and I've said this a number of times over the last couple of months, but that for the most part there hasn't been that much of a mages only meta, and I think that we get closer and closer to that with especially a really dominant black mage team, especially just because there's a lot of variety, a lot of power, and a lot of interesting units within that archetype. The vision cards for it are a little bit all over the place, but there's a ton of them, and now they have a tank. And I really think that, in the future, there's probably other units that you could be using instead of Dario that would give you a full black mage team. One that I'm particularly interested in would be bringing Veritas of the Waters into the mix and having the team that you see before you minus A2. A2, get out of here. I feel like this team could be particularly strong. The thing he was saying about having a lot of status effects, a lot of these units have had a lot of status. Veritas of the Waters brings in even more of those, and the diversity of status effects makes it harder for units like Dario, who actually has a sort of aura effect that would prevent some of these status effects. It really diversifies you and allows it to create a situation where it's harder to like tank or prep yourself for them. That being said, it is probably important to get the right trust runes if you're targeting this team. You're going to need something incredibly specific. And one of the reasons that you're going to need something incredibly specific, at least right now where we are at the moment, is because of that whole meta dynamic that we've always had. Spirit-based or magical tanks generally haven't been that good. Even one of the better ones that we had in Charlotte, and she was really good when she was good, absolutely fell apart when Helena hit the battlefield. But I think that if Silence does end up working out well against these, because I feel like a lot of their abilities, like main job stuff, probably wouldn't be silenceable, but you don't see Silence floating around a lot. And maybe they could counter that by just teching into, or if you're running a team like this, teching into, Silence resistance. But that might be a way to go on either side, and there's enough anti-magic, especially if you're running Dario on this team, there's enough anti-magic potential for this team that it could be kind of the counter to this team, with the exception of knowing that, I would imagine if, like, Dario, Helena, Oldoa players were playing a mirror match in Arena, just skip and hope you win. It feels probably like a coin flip, and that's probably not the best, but especially if you're building into anti-magic, the easiest way of countering this team might even be itself, in some ways. All of that being said, though, as I have said in a previous video, I feel like they're giving us these tanks so that they can really blow out the upper limits of what's possible for damage and offensive tech. I feel like offensive tech that removes auras is almost certainly coming. So teams like this that feel indomitable now may not feel so indomitable in the future. And one of the things, I'm not sure how much of a good thing is that it's coming immediately and in this way, but Volke is a 70 cost tank, which is, I feel, kind of unfortunate. He's a spear-based tank, so now the spear teams have a tank for themselves. He's also magically based, so he does magic damage. That potentially gives him a synergy with certain other teams that we've had here. And Spear has a lot of VCs, so they're a little bit easier to fit into teams, especially some other teams that you might not expect than you would think. And looking into this guy's kit, re-raise removal ceiling, but only for himself. Some kind of additional effect. This guy, luckily, is pretty decent at dealing with Oldoa. I don't think that probably counters this entire team. I think there's still some things that need to happen for a unit like this to be able to do that. So he protects re-raise and destroys courage. It feels like there's a lot of that going on. Also, physical damage shield here, which is good. This is pretty much the same thing that Helena has, except that it's also going to... except that, being a magically oriented tank, this is going to cover the other side for him and make him a lot more versatile. Also worth noting that he can confuse, so this is another high faith unit that has status. Single target resistance, spirit, and HP restores as kind of follow-up abilities. And then breaks pierce attack resistant, or increases his pierce attack resistance penetration before dealing damage, and gives him regen, which is always pretty helpful for a tank. Good damage, good range. He looks okay. Like, I definitely feel like he's... Because they're doing a run of these, and they are updating our magically oriented tanks, I think this is because there's a mage meta coming, and I think this is the beginning of it that we're seeing, and I think for people who want to play through that, they definitely need to think about how they can counter these magically based teams more and more. And I think that that probably means that you're either going for Dario, Oldoa, or Volke here, and picking up one of these, because I think that they're going to be important for countering the kind of degeneracy that we just saw, or at least giving you an opportunity to do that. And then if Silence does end up working out well against this team, then that means that potentially any heavy armor user, and I can think of at least one that would be interesting for this. Not sure that I have him queued up. Fortunately, Oldoa is not one. That would be interesting. But Ruinstern is getting an upgrade. He should be able to last at least 2 turns against these guys, because after Limit Burst, he's going to have Courage and have a Mirage Shield just from his Master ability. So hopefully he'll stay on the field long enough to do a couple of things that I think are going to be really important. And while I'm not sure how Silence is going to work, he is a heavy armor user, so he could run Tranquil Spirit in his buff rotation to give his hits the additional chance to inflict silence. One of the downsides to mage teams has always been that they just pick up status effects like they have just a magnetic charge to them. So getting silence on a mage is probably a little bit easier than you think. But in addition to that, skills like Hazard Render, especially, are going to be important. This is a big AoE, and, you know, maybe an AoE reduction aura is going to reduce the damage of this, but it will reduce their defense. But most importantly, it's going to be a big AoE healing power down. Because that's a big part of the equation here as to how these teams are doing particularly well. And we did have a long run that I noted previously where we were getting a lot of higher and higher tech in healing power reduction. So there's a lot of that floating around the game right now in slightly older units, and even in newer units as well. They never really quit making units that have healing power reduction abilities. So, especially being able to apply those healing reduction abilities in an AoE is going to be particularly important. So, you know, a unit like Ruinstern may actually be kind of important in countering something like this, even though he's definitely not an anti-magic unit himself. And it also, while Umbra noted what he did in his video, if you can turn off healing power, and you can also be particularly evasive, a team with 2 tanks is probably not going to hit you very often. Now, unfortunately, you're going to have to find a way to keep them from, prevent them from healing, and deal plenty of damage to them, all while maintaining, I mean, unless you're running all evasion, somebody's going to be getting hit. But, you know, you might be able to kind of chip them away more effectively with that, but I'm still not sure that's the counter that I think it could be. But really, you're going to have to spec into this team particularly. And if you're really spec to beat the kind of teams that have characterized wotv for like the last 3 or 4 years, and not these guys specifically, yeah, I would avoid this team like the plague. If you can pull it, it's probably going to be good into the future for a while, especially with what Umber was saying about reincarnation. Like, you know, these are definitely all units that benefit from being reincarnated a lot, tanks especially, and that's just going to make them so much worse. So this is a team that's going to grow even more oppressive over time. But I think that there's also a really high chance that this is the peak of its power now, which is okay. That's how new units should be. And that they will fall off over time. And just because, you know, if it was a meta where mages were the only thing that would work, then you would, I mean, there's just not a lot of history to pull from necessarily to build teams in the same way. Like, there just aren't as many things that you can use to counter a team like this, because typically teams like this haven't been that great, so they haven't taken a lot of power and tech to counter. Of course, we've been seeing things like this for a while, even with Helena and Vivi and Roth. That was an all-magic team that took a lot of effort to counter as well, and also hit you with a lot of status effects. So there's a lot of variations here and a lot of other teams that are particularly good at doing a lot of the things that... Let me switch back. A lot of the things that this team in particular can do. But I think that its combination of things, especially if you aren't prepared for it, it's probably pretty versatily FU to everyone. Now, with all of that being said, is this the new dominant team for Guild Battle Defense? Is this going to be a plague in higher level Guild Battle? Probably. This seems like the kind of sustained team that you really want. Like, eventually Dario's going to run out of Triple Drain, he's going to run out of Hate Generation and some of the follow-up healing there. But I think they do all generally pretty much have, like, healing counters and stuff that are available to them, so theoretically they could keep healing for quite some time. Because Oldoa gives herself healing 3 turns at a time, that's also pretty helpful. She can run out of that. I mean, even this team wouldn't last forever, but if they're that oppressive in Arena, I'm sure they might be able to hold up for multiple attacks against pretty much everything that currently exists on your guild battle teams for the most part. Now, I mean, this is going to mean that certain members of your guild are going to want to spec into teams that can deal with this, and what those teams are is still kind of up in the air. I mean, I would be personally interested in throwing my hat in the ring and trying to figure out how to deal with this team. And maybe I could start practicing on some of the other Magic teams, but it's definitely going to be a bit of a puzzle for wotv players to solve. So if you're interested or in theory crafting on how we take care of this team, please drop a comment below. Otherwise, definitely like and subscribe for more content like this, and check out the link in the description if you just want more Jackie Fox in general. With all that being said, see you in the next one.